You know, what I wanted to cover is basically, if you read the press and the books in the U.S. today, there's generally a story that's emerging, which is China has peaked. Its economy is now heading for a longer-term decline, which, of course, I don't agree with at all, because Americans know nothing about China.
That can be an interesting question, right? So what's the logic behind? Okay,
Well, there is no logic. Either one of the points, there's no logic. Because what I've done in the podcast I've done is basically said, what Americans don't understand is the power of the Chinese model. So one is the power of a single-party system as opposed to an adversarial two-party system, which means you get this all day and no results. You also elect a president from a new party and you get this, a lot of wasted energy, whereas in China you get fine-tuning, but always within the bounds of the longer-term direction. So it's just a much more powerful model. And then the second strength of the China model is the best and the brightest aspire to government service. So the talent in the government in China is dramatically, Americans hate to hear me say this, but it's just so true, dramatically better than it is in the U.S. And then the third one goes back to what I would call the civilization state of China, which gives you a unity of purpose and an alignment. So if you realize that 92% of the Chinese are Han and grew up with Confucian values, and you compare that to the U.S., we have so many different ethnic groups. And we have the polarity of very different socioeconomic groups. And so you wind up with what we have today, which is a very divisive interactive model. And then the fourth thing I point out that's a strength is just work ethic. The Chinese work harder. Now part of it is related to the Industrial Revolution and when people hit their high income period. So the U.S. has been in its high income period really after World War II. So starting in the 50s, it's been a pretty wealthy environment in the sense of housing, cars, and hours of work that are very reasonable. Whereas if you go back to the 19th century, you had a lot more of the kind of energy that you see in China today. Because you had your Industrial Revolution with Deng. And so a lot of this is explained, but Americans really don't get into that at all. They will tend to say, oh, China, that's a communist country, therefore it's like Russia. Russia failed.
I think we are lucky today to have you as a long-time watcher of China.
Well, except I don't pay any attention to what I say.
You are in very unique position to make comments on the China, on the shape of the Chinese economy, U.S.-China relations. You have engaged in business community as a senior partner of McKinsey company. As a very important positions, you're working on the board of directors, and in the different business positions are very important. And you travel a lot to China, have a very deep connection with China. Yes, I think you talk about some people, some media in the U.S. talking about the Chinese economy has peaked. That means they expect that China is in the course of declining. What's the reasons for you to be more optimistic than these people?
Well, a lot of it goes back to the model itself. In other words, if I take the power of a single party as opposed to an adversarial two-party system, and I take high talent people, because that's where the most talented people go, is government service, not business. And then if you add to that a civilization state where everyone's on the same page, the U.S., if you're a Republican or Democrat, you can barely talk to the other person. Whereas here, people don't always agree on exactly, but it's at the margin. You don't have, we came within one vote, having spent billions of dollars to install Obamacare, one vote under Trump of eliminating it. would have cost tens of billions of dollars to start over.
Right.
And us in China, it's always, well, we might go this far, we might go that far, but it's always within a reasonable band. And you have informed people.
This work, I just share your view.
Yeah.
So I think your is optimistic, observations about the Chinese economy remind me back to the 1990s and even the time when China joined the WTO.
Yes.
Right, some people, some so-called China experts expressed the feeling Chinese economy will collapse. That is, but just the economic reality of the Chinese economy has been just opposite. That the economic rising, the growing influence of the Chinese economy in the world. So I think that is a very important lesson to us. From your remarks, I also think that is when we discuss the economic future of China, it's very important to remember the influence of history and culture.
Yes.
Civilizations.
Totally.
In China. As when we observe the U.S. economy, they also very important bear in mind.
Yes.
The culture.
Yes.
And civilizations.
Yes.
Okay, I have another questions to ask for your opinion. See, back to the most of times, even before the Trump came to power, U.S. government claims that growing and bigger, powerful, and more prosperous China is good to the U.S. U.S. has to see that the common interest there. But since Trump, so that is a rhetoric that the mentality in the U.S. seems to be changed.
Yeah.
Okay, that even like this government target China. China's the most serious challenge to U.S. international status.
Yes.
Right. So I would ask for your opinion. So what your observations about the competition, the common interests between the U.S.-China? U.S.-China as two largest economy in the world. Very important to us and to the world.
Well, I guess one thing I would point to as a very fundamental difference is that the Chinese government controls all the levers that drive the economy. That's not true in the U.S. The executive branch does not set interest rates. That's done by the Federal Reserve Board. The U.S. government doesn't really set tax policy. That's done largely in the legislature. Even when you get to things like tariffs and the trade rules, that comes out of the legislature. So what you have in the U.S. is different pockets of experts who have certain levels of authority subject to checks and balances across judicial, legislative, and executive. So you don't have the ability to say, if we take all these pieces and fit them together, are they going to work? Right. In China, you have that ability because the government has control of everything that matters. So that's one huge difference economically. The second difference is the power of industrial policy. So no one in the U.S. talks about it, but if you look at how long it took China to go from world's leading manufacturer driven entirely by low-cost labor to being number one in a highly advanced manufacturing. That happened within probably 15 years, a relatively short period of time. Because when you look at where China got to in manufacturing, it was state-of-the-art in the world. Yeah. And because it had lost its low. And now you look at 2025. So you look at automobiles. China had no automobile industry that mattered if you go back 12, 13 years ago. Right. So you had a concerted effort to basically go after EVs, starting with batteries. And here we are 12 years later, and China produces more than half all the EVs in the world. Before I left home, I was reading an article in the New York Times. Right. What's going to happen to Detroit? Detroit started to say, we're going to convert to EVs, but everyone realized their EVs aren't very good.
Yeah.
They're expensive, and they're nowhere near as sophisticated as the Chinese are.
Right.
So if you take industrial policy and apply it not just to EVs, but to renewable energies and to quantum computing and to AI and biotech, you know, and there's certain areas where the U.S. still has a lead. I mean, the U.S. has a clear lead in nanochips, probably in biotech. I think in AI you could probably argue, because I think China's great at application.
Right.
The U.S. is more aligned against basic research. The third one is, obviously we've touched on, is just talent. If you were to take the 10 people in the U.S. who are really going to be taking the lead on whatever the government can do, given the form of government, and compare them with the top 10 in China, there's no comparison.
Yes, I think you have made very interesting points to help us to understand what is real going on in the Chinese economy with regard to the issue of industrial policy.
Yes.
That is a part of the reasons which has caused some of the suspicions that mistrust between each other. I would like to say the U.S.-China at the very different stage of development. China is still a developing country.
Yes.
Is climbing up the ladder of the global supply chain. The U.S. is still at the top of the industrial chains. There is no doubt about that. Industrial policy or economic policy, they come out with this very specific context. Different development stages, different culture and history experience. So that is U.S.-China now, I think, is very helpful to understand. So U.S. used to be, also has some kind of industrial policy in the industry. U.S. used to be has a very high, very highly protectionist trade policy, or at least we will see in the histories that is some cycles of free trade and protectionist before the 1934, for example. Right? So that is because at that time, in the 1930s, as a part of response to the Great Impression, the U.S. government has passed a very high protectionist tariff legislation, similar to early 1930. And of course, we know that the consequences was very serious.
Yes.
Just to continue the economic battleship caused the trade war among the major economies. Even, in my opinion, that led to the very tragic of the World War II. Okay, that is economic, trade, foreign policy are connected with each other. On the industry policy, you talk about the development of China's EV industries. I would like to see that mainly comes from the competition, coming from the market size. China has some advantages about the competition. And of course, that is local government has the policy, has some kind of assistance or help on development of this sector. So that is the reality is much more complicated. Just attribute to one factor, single factor, that the industry policy.
Right.
I think some analysis in the media has exaggerated the power or influence of China's state policy to label China as so-called state capitalism.
Yes.
Okay, that might be not fit well with the reality.
Yeah.
The U.S. should not be too frightened, to be terrified about China's EV industries. I noticed that when the New York Times reported about the Biden administration's decision on investigation of the software.
Which is ridiculous.
In the EV. But I look at the top 20 of the readers' response. Most of them are very negative about the U.S. policy on this. From the perspectives of consumers, you look forward to have, as you said, there's a less expensive EV cars. Good to the consumers,
yes,
as well as good to the environment.
Yes, I agree completely. But you need to go back, I think, a little bit to how the U.S. views industrial policy at a high level. Because I think if you were to ask most Americans, talk to me about industrial policy, they'd say, that's called dumping excess supply. We've got too much steel in our inventory, so we're going to dump it at below market rates. And then the other thing they'll refer to is subsidies from the government to keep alive otherwise declining and failing companies. So if you compare that with a commitment to get out in front on EVs, to tap into the best talent by companies, by universities, and by government, to figure out what tax policies and subsidies are required to help the companies make the right investments early on, and then to monitor it against a very disciplined 5-year planning process. So I would say to the U.S., even if you wanted to develop an industrial policy tomorrow, you're going to have to go down a learning curve that China has been going down for the last 40 years. And you're not going to do it overnight. So if you look at chips, the U.S. has turned to the Commerce Department, which has no background in chips whatsoever, and said, all right, we're going to distribute X billions of dollars, and you are going to decide which of the chip companies we're going to support. Well, they have no basis for doing that. So it's going to be a very uneven process. And the other thing that's a huge advantage for China, I spent a lot of time when I was writing my book talking to people who were involved in the 5-year planning process. So when you walk through that and you realize there are top-level goals set by the government, you then develop much more detailed plans. You then go by province and by industry to tailor the plans to exactly what's going on. And then you would do a bottoms-up process and say, which of the overarching goals are we being too aggressive, not aggressive enough? But by the time you hash it all out, everybody's on the same page. So if you compare that to our financial involvement of the government in shaping the economy, the only thing that Congress votes on is the budget for the year. Last year, the budget was 1,300 pages long, and it was distributed to Congress one day before the vote. So you compare these two models, which one's going to be effective? And that's why I'm saying that intellectually it sounds simple, but the first thing the U.S. has to do is to recognize that industrial policies are not about dumping and not about propping up poor performing. It's about shaping the future of the economy. And if you don't have 5-year plans and that kind of discipline, which happens over, not probably extends more than a year until it's all done, you're not going to be able to execute it. And I think is the real challenge of the U.S. because it's not just the idea, it's the skill set. And so our provinces used to, going back over 40 years, having the interactions with the central government on what the numbers ought to be and how you get there. Of course, they get better at it every year. And they don't always agree. But at the end of the day, it's a pretty smart dialogue, and they agree on the numbers.
Wow. That's a very important point. I think that you are in the very good positions to compare U.S. and Chinese economic and industrial policy. That is something I think a lot of people want to do. I think that is have a lot of policy implications. I want to ask for your opinions about so-called Biden's economics. So in that part, we have in the last several years, the U.S. government seems to be learning from China its industry policy to give tremendous subsidies to the industries in the chip makers and others, right? So what's your assessment of the Biden's economics?
Well, first of all, I would say when people try to explain what it is, it's hard because it's not that clear. So if I look at what he takes credit for, our first major infrastructure investment in many years. Well, from my point of view, it's probably 25 years too late. Now, it's better late than never.
Right.
But if you look at how long China has been investing in infrastructure, and if you look at the power of the high-speed rails and what it has done, because it has kind of a multiplier effect. Every time you add a new station and you lay new track, you are getting access to more markets.
Yeah.
And so even though early on the economics probably didn't look attractive, when it's all done, it's very attractive. But you're going to see if Trump is elected, just as he went after Obamacare, he will go after infrastructure, and he will try to undo whatever Biden did. Not because it's the right answer, but because he needs to win, and Biden needs to lose. And it's really that simple. So when you bring that mindset, and this is why I said, when you've got polarization to the degree we do today, there's a real tendency to reverse course in a way that turns out to be quite inefficient. But there's not a lot to. I think Biden would say infrastructure was one of his real accomplishments. I'd say he tried to increase taxes for the wealthy and provide more relief for the middle class and the lower class. He's not able to get that done with a Republican legislature because they're much more aligned around trickle-down economics, which is based on a never-proven theory that if you make the rich richer, they'll spend more and invest more. The studies in the U.S. show that when you make them richer, if anything, they're more cautious with how they invest, and so they buy back stock, which doesn't lead to anything in terms of net value added, but it improves their own economics of the wealthy people. So Bidenomics, it's not a highly comprehensive, multi-dimensional, multi-year, and it really can't be, because with a 4-year election system, if you put in place a fundamental change in how the economy works, and you lose the next election, it's going to get unraveled.
You're right. I hope the Biden administration can work for the United States. As you point out, the infrastructure is very necessary.
Absolutely.
Upgrading renewal of the U.S. infrastructure system is helpful to the U.S. economy.
Yes.
And I also hope the other economy can also benefit from the U.S. constructions of infrastructures.
Yes.
By the way, on that part, and the U.S.-China can work together. China has, over the decades, China has accumulated apparent technology and even some investment on this. So if U.S. comes to be more open to the Chinese infrastructure companies, they can make the work, the projects be better, they can be less costly, more efficient, and that can be very important to the U.S. economy, to the economic cooperation between U.S.-China.
Yeah. But you know what? I don't think it's ever going to happen.
Very unfortunately.
If you look at where the tensions are today, the things that are being disputed are really not what I would call highly sensitive security-based issues.
Right.
So if you looked at the tariffs and the sanctions that were related to chips, you would hear dialogues in the U.S. where people would say, well, those restrictions are very sweeping and go well beyond what's actually highly sensitive and specific technologies that the U.S. has, which are largely tied up in nanochips. But the size of the chip industry is dramatically bigger than just nanochips. But you will hear government officials say, well, it may not be necessary from a security point of view, but it will hurt the Chinese economy. And so when you've got that mindset, you're just not going to get things done that make economic sense. And of course, the net effect of the U.S. trying to make it difficult for China to advance in nanochips, what's China's response going to be? We're going to invest more money, we're going to provide more incentives, and we're going to get our best companies and our talent aligned to close the gap as quickly as possible. So the net effect is China's going to get faster to the point of being independent and not needing the U.S. and chips. But that's the challenge you have. Is right now, the U.S.-China rivalry is an emotional rivalry that is not grounded in logic.